From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. David Gura in for Joe Matthew and Kayleigh Lyons on this Tuesday as the President of the United States sits down with the Prime Minister of Canada to talk trade and other issues in the White House. We heard from Mark Carney and from Donald Trump just a few moments ago talking about the relationship between the two countries, the outlook for the renegotiation of the U.S.-Mexico trade deal. Saw the Mexican peso, the Canadian dollar strengthen on those comments as the President said unequivocally that deal is not dead and sees opportunity for renegotiation around the edges. Coming up here in the next hour, we're going to check in with our colleagues at the Milken Global Conference in Beverly Hills, California. A very interesting interview sure to take place between Bill Pulte and our Sonali Basak. Bill Pulte, of course, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency at a pivotal time here for Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. Lots to come, lots to get to here. But first, let's get a check of a Bloomberg Business Flash with our Amy Morris. Amy?
All right, thank you, David. The U.S. trade deficit in goods and services set a record in March. Imports of consumer goods posted an all-time high, led by pharmaceuticals, as businesses rushed inbound foreign shipments to beat U.S. tariffs. Now, President Trump says he will dictate tariff levels for U.S. trading partners rather than engaging in back-and-forth negotiations. And Wall Street's mood is tied to repercussions of the trade war. We do check markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 down 0.7%, NASDAQ down 0.8%. The Dow down 0.8%. The Russell 2000 index now down 1.1%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.34% and the 2-year yield at 3.79%. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent repeated his warning that his department is on the warning track toward exhausting its capacity to stay within the federal debt limit. He did not say when that might happen. He also told the House Appropriations Committee that Treasury is still tallying the tax revenue from the latest filing season and that Treasury will share with Congress when they're getting close to the default date. Friedrich Merz got the backing of a parliament in a second vote for Germany's next chancellor, coming as Germany's economy is stagnating and support for the far-right alternative for Germany is getting stronger. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back now to Balance of Power with David Gura.
Amy, thank you very much. David Gura in for Joe Matthew and Kayleigh Lyons here on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio with Balance of Power, a fascinating vote. Two fascinating votes, I should say, that took place in Germany today. Our focus now shifts to the White House, where a meeting is underway between President Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney. The cameras have been moved out of the Oval Office. That will happen behind closed doors. There's a lunch to follow as well. But a lot of good spirits, I should say, in the room, in the Oval Office, as those two leaders sat in front of the fireplace and took a few questions from reporters. Paying close attention to that was our Tyler Kendall, our Washington correspondent here at Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. And Tyler, I'd love to just get your reaction to the way all of this unfolded. We were watching as Mark Carney got out of the car and walked into the White House. There was a handshake, there were waves, there was a fist raised as well. There seemed to be good spirits among these two leaders, and I wonder how that translated into the comments that you heard in the Oval Office a few moments ago.
Yeah, hey, David, definitely the appearance of good spirits, but at the same time, President Trump did say that there was nothing that Mark Carney could say that would change the tariffs. Likely not welcome news for the Prime Minister as they embark on this first face-to-face meeting here at the White House. At the same time, though, President Trump was rather complimentary of Mark Carney, congratulating him on winning the election, which perhaps you know better than anyone. You were on the ground in Ottawa. Mark Carney campaigned heavily on countering this White House and its trade policies. President Trump did add that he would love to see a deal with Canada, but ultimately there's been very little progress when it comes to these trade talks, at least publicly, and now it appears more uncertain than ever on what President Trump actually would like to see done. Now, when it does come to USMCA, you did allude to this at the top there. President Trump said that it has been effective. He called it a good deal for everyone, but that people need to follow it, saying that there could be subtle changes. Carney chimed in there saying that USMCA does need to change when those terms do expire in July. This is a really high-stakes meeting, David, considering that this is the first face-to-face meeting that these leaders have engaged in, and Mark Carney actually sort of tried to lower the expectations ahead of it, saying that he knows that these are going to be difficult talks, but he ultimately hopes constructive.
And the president, the prime minister, talking kind of sweeping terms about both the relationship and the trade deal that's in place, the USMCA trade deal right now, talking about kind of nuance and subtlety. Speaking kind of similar terms here about the issue of sovereignty, which I think is one that a lot of people were wondering sort of how the president would broach or what he would say about it over the course of that meeting. He said they were not going to be discussing it during their Oval Office meeting today or at that luncheon as well. Let me pull back, and there were some questions from reporters just about the state of play when it comes to trade deals and trade negotiations. A question specific about what kind of meetings may or may not have happened between the U.S. and China, the president responding to that, but also indicating that there are, as he put it, 25 countries who are lying in wait, eager to make a deal with the United States. I'd love to get your perspective on sort of where things stand on this broader issue of trade deals and trade negotiations between this White House and trading partners all over the world.
Right, definitely. And the numbers sort of keep shifting here, but one consistency is that officials keep pointing us to the fact that we could see potential agreements, framework agreements, as soon as this week. Of course, we're not expecting those fully fledged out deals that can take months to negotiate. And we had the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Capitol Hill earlier today actually saying that they are not currently in negotiations with China, but that he does think some of these priority countries that have been given priorities in these talks, including those Asian economies like Japan, South Korea, and India, could see these frameworks announced as soon as this week. He also gave us another timeline, which is that 80 to 90% of the top 15 trading partners could ultimately see deals by the end of this year. That appears to be the broader goal when it comes to this administration. But there is, of course, just still so much uncertainty. Take Canada, for example. There is a long list of grievances here. President Trump highlighting two of them, talking about autos as well as energy. And that really reminds us that these countries that are negotiating, of course, the so-called reciprocal tariff plan, which does not apply to Canada. They were facing their own 25% tariff with USMCA exemptions separately, but all these countries are also facing those sector-specific tariffs, and that's going to be a very important theme going forward here, as this White House really does seem to put forward that these are going to be the more durable tariffs, as President Trump yesterday, David, said that in the next 2 weeks we could see something added to that list when it comes to pharmaceutical-specific tariffs.
Tyler, great to get that update. Appreciate it. That's Tyler Kendall for us there at the White House. And then just going back to that one question a reporter asked, is there anything that Mark Carney could say during the course of this meeting that would cause President Trump to remove those tariffs? President Trump said unequivocally, no. So we'll see how all of this progresses. It's a busy afternoon, a meeting, a lunch, and then we're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister of Canada as well, as he holds a news conference a little later this afternoon, about 3 o'clock. Washington time. We'll bring you headlines from that as that unfolds as well. President having a number of events on his schedule as well. Tyler Kendall, just a moment ago, mentioning Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary. He was in California yesterday in Beverly Hills for the Milken Institute's Global Conference and delivered remarks directed squarely at some of the most important investors here in the U.S. and around the world. And that's where we're going to return now. My colleague, Jeanne, who's the anchor of Open Interest on Bloomberg Television, and our chief Wall Street correspondent is there. She's been conducting a series of important interviews over the course of these last few days. She has another one teed up now here with Bill Pulte, who's the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, an agency that oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac at a very pivotal moment for those two institutions. I'm going to toss it to her now in Beverly Hills, California at the Global Conference. Jeanne?
Yeah, David, thank you very much for your time. I am alongside Bill Pulte here, a number of members of the administration here at the Milken Global Institute. But Bill Pulte is, of course, the FHFA director, oversees Fannie and Freddie. A big question for Americans as well as investors as well. The first Trump administration they initially tried to free Fannie and Freddie from government control, get it out of conservatorship. What do we know about that experience as you look to maybe take it out of conservatorship this time around?
Well, just generally speaking, President Trump obviously knew what he was doing first term, knew it very well. This time it's like on steroids, and we knew exactly what we needed to do then, and we know even more so what we need to do now. Now, I don't mean that necessarily in terms of privatization. I mean that just generally. For instance, my predecessor was Mark Calabria in the first term. He worked very hard on this issue, but he worked hard on other issues. Many of the ideas that he didn't get done in his first term, we're now able to execute on and really drive performance in the business. And that's really where our focus is right now.
So on the issue of privatization as well, what could be different this time?
Well, I think right now what we're doing is making sure that these businesses are actually functioning as businesses, where people would find them attractive, where they weren't run with big bloat, where they weren't social engineering programs run by let's say, politicians, but instead where they were focused on safety and soundness and earnings. I mean, Sonali, we had 16,000 people that were working from home, essentially. We ordered them all back to work. We're driving efficiency in these companies. If I told you the waste, fraud, and abuse we found, you wouldn't even believe some of the stuff we found.
Well, be specific there. You've been talking about waste, fraud, and abuse within the agencies. What exactly had been happening?
Well, we, for instance, recently criminally referred some North Koreans and Chinese for working inside of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I mean, what are the Chinese and the North Koreans doing in these companies? That's just one example. I could give you other examples of contracts that we've done. The bureaucracy between FHFA, so the U.S. Federal Housing, which I oversee, and the companies. We're eliminating the unnecessary bureaucracy between the agency and the companies to get things going. I mean, I've closed out probably over 50, I've made 50 plus directives or closures of excessive paperwork, stuff even going back to Obama's time where they were just reporting on them for no reason. The amount of nonsense going on is truly staggering, and these are going to be great American icons once again.
I'm sorry, can you be a little more specific there? When you said that there were Chinese and North Koreans working for the agencies, do you mean non-U.S. citizens? What exactly?
Correct. Correct. There were non-citizens working who were posing as either real Americans or, in some cases, contractors. And we also recently uncovered some other things where some of the Indians were also working inside of the companies as well. So more to come on that. But I think we've referred 5 or 6 different people to the DOJ just in terms of North Koreans and Chinese working in the companies.
So when it comes to your initiative here to really take a look at, you're saying waste, fraud, and abuse within the agency, is the idea here to clean up the agencies to become private entities?
Well, ultimately, that will be a question for President Trump. President Trump's going to be, obviously, is the deal maker of the century. I mean, there's nobody who knows how to make a deal better than President Trump. So if and when he does that, we will be ready. We are getting ready for just being operationally efficient, not necessarily privatization. And that is really where our focus is right now. If and when something were to happen, our main focus would be to make sure that there was no disruption to the mortgage market and that there wouldn't be any upward pressure on rates.
So ultimately, when it comes to the efficiency plans, how much does it fall on you versus DOJ efforts to tackle them?
Yeah, DOJ has not been involved in Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. We would welcome them, frankly, because I think they're very bright people. But we are doing our own cost cutting, our own trimming of the fat, so to speak, and again, getting rid of some of this fraud. But again, we're really ready to focus and have been focusing, at least since I've been in office 8 weeks, on that operational efficiency side of things.
When you're looking at any potential issues across the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac programs, are you looking at multifamily lending programs specifically?
Yes, I'm very focused on multifamily lending programs. In particular, I was unsettled with some things that I found in multifamily when I first started. That was part of the reason that I did some of the changes that I made at the board level, including the chairmanship, was I felt like I needed to get involved and have the FHFA director be intimately involved in some of the multifamily stuff. And that was one big reason that, you know, we've been a little bit more hands-on, is to make sure that there's none of that nonsense going on. The good news is these are safe and sound businesses, but we're going to make them even safer and sounder.
What types of behavior are you looking into exactly when it comes to multifamily?
Well, there's been some things which we'll be releasing at some point where, you know, people were underwriting certain loans and then flipping them either to friends or to colleagues and then re-underwriting them. So, you know, it's mortgage fraud. You know, we've had a big focus on mortgage fraud. We're going to keep focusing on mortgage fraud because we never want to have another 08 happen again. And under President Trump, we're not going to let that happen.
Now, a little earlier, you also said when it comes to the future of Fannie and Freddie, you are keeping your eye closely on mortgage rates. Of course, there's a lot of concern among a number of lawmakers that privatizing Fannie and Freddie could unleash higher rates. How could you ensure that won't happen?
Well, it's something that my friend and colleague, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and I are laser focused on. We'll be working very closely on that, be studying the issue, figuring out what it is that would make sure that if and when that were ever to happen, it wouldn't be the case. But we're not there yet, and as I said, it will ultimately be up to the president, but look forward to working with the Treasury Secretary and making sure that anything we think about doesn't affect the mortgage market in any negative way.
So have you had specific meetings with the Treasury Secretary or the president about a privatization plan?
I don't want to say what meetings we have or haven't had. I do maintain a good relationship with the Treasury Secretary, and I think that you know, he's a great partner in terms of not just the topics that you're mentioning, but also the day-to-day. You know, Treasury has certain rights and ownership in the company or rights to ownership in the company. And so I'd say one of the best things about this administration is that everybody is working together for the common goal of making America great again. And I'm very confident that that will lean towards making Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac great again. I'm very confident in it.
Ultimately, we're sitting in a period where a lot of people are looking at this as a very serious affordability crisis in the United States. You have a family that's long been in the real estate business. What do you think the administration could be doing to fix it?
Well, first things first is getting rid of inflation. And President Trump, as far as I'm concerned, has been doing a beautiful job on that end. Why? Because inflation kills the economy. It kills the housing economy. Sonali, for the last 4 years, home prices have skyrocketed. The price of drywall, the price of lumber, the price of cabinets, countertops, shower baths, all the raw materials that go into homes skyrocketed. And it made it so people couldn't afford homes. Yes, we have a supply crisis, but we also have an inflation crisis. And President Trump is all over it. And frankly, it's going to require a lot of work to reverse what's happened in the last 4 years.
You know, speaking of the last 4 years, in it, we have seen significant issues with the banking system as well, and a lot of questions about the federal home loan banks as well. This is something where when you're looking at efficiencies across the system, do you also take a look at governance issues as well?
Yes, I'm focused on the FHL banks, as you mentioned. We are the regulator of those banks. I'm very focused on it. I met recently with the presidents of those banks and told them a little bit about my expectations around regulations and making sure that they don't get out over their skis and that we're going to be focused very closely on it. It's not something that gets a lot of attention, like, you know, the prospective privatization or not of Fannie and Freddie, but those banks are very important, as you know. We have $1 trillion worth of assets on the balance sheet, and we fund a lot of local banks and a lot of local lending. So stay tuned on the banks. What
will change ultimately? Because maybe a lot of other people might not pay attention, but certainly Bloomberg does, the banking system does.
Well, we're going to get rid of the climate requirements and the DEI requirements for board members. These are banks. They need to focus on lending to people in local areas who not only can pay back the loans, but who can benefit from the loans and really spur local economic growth, not on driving climate change programs through these local banks. It's nonsense and it needs to go. And I told the presidents of the banks that much and much more to come on that.
Bill, we have to leave it there. That is Bill Pulte, of course, the director of the FHFA. We are here at the Milken Global Institute. David, back to you.
Sonali, thank you very much. And a fascinating interview there with somebody who has a very important job now at a very pivotal moment here in Washington. Bill Pulte, the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And just a few things that stood out to me over the course of that interview is the way that he talked about the regulatory remit that organization has. This is, of course, a fairly new entity within Washington policy and politics. It's been around just since 2008 after the global financial crisis. But this conversation about privatization of those two entities, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, is something that's very much a live issue here in Washington. And I was struck, too, when Bill Pulte said, as he thinks about where the organization heads, what it looks like, that DOGE, Elon Musk's team, who's been making radical changes here to the federal government, as he put it, has not been involved in Fannie and Freddie thus far. Again, just a fascinating conversation there, and a chapter in what will be a fascinating story here going forward when it comes to where that organization heads and what happens to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I want to pick up on something else that crossed the terminal here just a moment ago. If you were watching or listening to the president's remarks there in the Oval Office, he spent some time talking about an agreement that he said had been brokered with the Houthis, that they were going to stop attacking ships in the Red Sea. We're getting a response now from the Houthis saying, a spokesman saying, that the group will not stop doing that. There's been no agreement to do that. This is in a conversation with Bloomberg News. The Houthis, through that spokesperson, saying President Trump's statement is not an accurate one. Again, responding to comments made during remarks that took place in the Oval Office ahead of a meeting that is underway right now in the White House between President Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney, the 24th Prime Minister of Canada. A much anticipated meeting, and we'll continue to bring you headlines from that if there are any more that follow after that closed-door meeting takes place. Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on Bloomberg Television. David Gura, and for Kaylee Lyons and Joe Matthew. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Plus, you can listen anytime on Bloomberg.com.
It's 121 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks moved away from their session lows after Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent signaled that negotiations with several commercial partners are going well. We do check markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 down 0.6%, NASDAQ down 0.8%, the Dow down 0.7%, really about 0.75% at this point. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.32% and the 2-year yield at 3.79%. Now, Secretary Bessent said many countries have good offers, reiterating that some deals may be announced as soon as this week, and he noted the possibility of a substantial reduction in tariffs on U.S. goods. But this, even as President Trump says he will dictate tariff levels for U.S. trading partners rather than engaging in back-and-forth negotiations. Secretary Bessent also repeated his warning that his department is on the warning track toward exhausting its capacity to stay within the federal debt limit. He did not say when that might happen. He did tell the House Appropriations Committee that Treasury is still tallying tax revenue from the latest filing season and that Treasury will share with Congress when they're getting close to the default date. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Balance of Power with David Gura.
Amy, thank you very much. David Gura in for Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. Meetings at the White House taking place now between the Canadian Prime Minister and the President of the United States. A luncheon will follow, and we expect to hear from the Prime Minister at a press conference he'll convene a little bit later this afternoon. Bring you headlines both from those meetings and that press conference as they cross the Bloomberg. I want to return to it now with our panel, our all-star panel here with me in Washington. We have Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital, Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributors both. Jeanne, I want to ask you sort of what the ideal outcome is from the meeting that takes place today. So it sounds like from the prelude that we got from the President and the Prime Minister, we shouldn't expect a lot of granular details here or any advancement in kind of the standoff when it comes to trade and tariffs policy. What are you looking for or listening for when these meetings conclude?
Yeah, I think the first thing is even if they don't strike a deal, is Carney able to walk this very difficult line of holding the support, which of course he's having trouble forming a government there, but holding the support that got him elected narrowly, and still being able to maintain a positive relationship with Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump downplaying expectations of a trade deal, so was Carney. But Donald Trump also said never say never. So the ideal scenario would be there is a step forward, that Carney has come with something to offer the president that the president can buy into. And I think the positive thing was that the UMCA, he said, is still a vital agreement if revised. And of course, even if he said that he can't see a world in which he would remove those tariffs imminently, maybe there is be some ground in which they could deal. I think that's what we're really looking for. And of course, then the president also talked about foreign policy, which was interesting, on Ukraine and Russia. So do we see any glimmers of hope for agreement there?
The USMCA not dead, in the words of the President of the United States. And Rick, I want to turn to you just about the uniqueness of these meetings and this bilateral relationship. We're looking at so many of them as these trade deals get hammered out behind the scenes. Of course, the big one is between the U.S. and China, and we got some insight from the president to sort of where things stand there, that there's an eagerness on the Chinese side, as he said, for there to be a meeting, for one to take place. When you look at how this meeting is unfolding between the Prime Minister and the President, is it entirely unique, or are there lessons to be learned here by other countries who are hoping for some resolution to the stalemate that they have between their countries and the United States?
Yeah, this president is particularly good at orchestration of the presidency, and he likes heads of state to come, be greeted at the White House, sit in the Oval Office, hear from the reporter questions, make statements. He drives a lot of press this way. It'll dominate our day, this kind of dialogue. And then, sit down and either one, like today, build a new relationship, or two, hammer out agreements, or at least create a process where there can be an agreement. And obviously, right now, trade is the number one issue, but it could be national security. It could be all kinds of different issues on a geopolitical basis. But President Trump really likes to orchestrate the presidency. I mean, remember, the first thing out of his mouth, hey, what do you think of my new decorations? 24 karat gold. Don't they look great? I mean, that's the opening gambit. and two heads of state from neighboring countries where there's been a lot of tension. So he likes the show. He puts on a good show. Sometimes it's a positive one, like today with Mark Carney, sort of repairing a new relationship with Canada. We don't need to have that kind of tension going on, especially during the Stanley Cup playoffs. But it can go the other way. And, Vladimir Zelensky experienced the downside to that meeting is if you don't pay attention, take the cues, like Mark Carney did today, then it could blow up in your face. I mean, Mark Carney had a moment there where he was about to interrupt, and you could see he barely talk, and then realize, whoops, I'm just going to retreat back into my seat and let the show continue.
He did have that great line about Canada not being for sale, saying, that President Trump appreciates real estate and knows real estate, and there are some properties in the world that are not for sale, decidedly not for sale. The White House, Buckingham Palace, and Canada, they're in that trifecta. I've been remiss in focusing so much on the White House and not on the goings-on on Capitol Hill, so I want to turn there now because, of course, there's this race underway among Republicans on the Hill, on the House side in particular, to find some agreement here, move that reconciliation process forward. And we had a meeting of the Republican conference, this morning on Capitol Hill. And afterward, we heard from House Speaker Mike Johnson just on the status of those talks and the progress that's being made. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
The intention was to work through some of the final details, but we realized that we were still awaiting some key numbers on calculations on some of the provisions with tax and some of the other details. And it just made sense for us to push pause for a week to make sure that we do this right. We didn't want to move this quickly, speed for the sake of speed. We want to get it right. And so everybody in the room agreed that it made sense for us to do that.
Rick Davis, I want your thoughts on Republican realism there, and I think we got a glimpse of that from the House Speaker. He's talked about Memorial Day being a target. We've heard Independence Day, July 4th being floated as well. As you look at the timetable, what makes sense to you as you kind of assess the progress that is or isn't being made among Republicans in Congress?
Yeah, in order to translate, get it right, what it really means to the American public is we don't have the votes. Otherwise, they would charge forward with these committees. This week, there were supposed to be markups in committees like agriculture to hammer out things related to programs like the SNAP program, how we feed people under the poverty line. And so the fact is that there's been enough members out publicly, you can count them just in the press, that they wouldn't have a vote that could pass any of these amendments. And some really intractable things like Jeanne's favorite tax, the SALT tax. There is not unanimity within a Republican caucus as to what to do with that or how to pay for it. It's not in the current marks. And so I think that's what he's talking about is we've got to figure out what that number is going to be and then maybe try to round up some votes between now and the 4th of July.
About that favorite tax of yours, or the SALT tax, Jeanne, sort of how does the leadership of the Republicans in the House get his raucous caucus on board with this? In other words, you had that meeting this morning. It seems like there still isn't a lot of unanimity or agreement going forward here. Just give us a sense of sort of how formidable that challenge is and what it's going to be as you see it that would get all the Republicans in line to vote for this bill.
I like that descriptor, David, raucous caucus, because that really is an apt way to sort of encapsulate what is going on here. You've got these, groups in the Republican Party that are really drawing red lines. And one of them met last night, and that was the hardliners, the budget hawks, who are saying the GOP leadership, the Senate, they're not doing enough to address the deficit. And of course, we've heard from these folks all along. But then, as Rick mentioned, you have my favorite, the moderates from the SALT area, the SALT caucus, as we call them. They want that cap raised. They simply can't get reelected without it. Then you have the Medicaid defenders. So, you can go on and on. There's even the IRA people, the people who are saying, hey, wait a minute. We want the IRA protected. We know that was Joe Biden's work, but quite frankly, it helped our constituents. We can't vote to rob them of what they got out of the IRA. So how Mike Johnson threads this needle is the big question here. I don't know how he does it, but as he started off with an Easter deadline, Memorial Day, and now July 4th, it seems that he's hitting all the major holidays. So I'll go with Labor Day. I think what they'll get is probably the 2017 tax extension, but I am not convinced they get much more than that. But of course, if they don't, just look at the deficit hawks. What do they do then? They're not going to be happy. So I wouldn't like to be Mike Johnson right now. He's got a really, really hard uphill battle trying to get this done.
And I suppose a less celebrated or celebratory holiday is the X date, which we still don't know when that's going to happen here, but that could be a forcing mechanism as well for some action on Capitol Hill. And we heard the Treasury Secretary talk about that, speak about it, warn about it today, but he's not yet offering a definitive sense of when that X date is going to be. Rick, I'm going to take advantage of you being here to help me prep for an interview I have a little bit later today. I'm going to talk to the chair of the House Budget Committee, Jody Arrington, on Capitol Hill. What do you want to hear from him? Help me break a little news here as he kind of watches all of this unfold in other committees. What does he want to see get done? What does he need to do?
Yeah, obviously the biggest challenge that Chairman Arrington's got is to reconcile all these pieces, the Agriculture Committee, the Energy and Commerce, in order to get the cost cuts close to $2 trillion that the conservatives are demanding in order to pass this bill. That's the number one. But number two is he doesn't have a deal with his Senate counterpart, Lindsey Graham. They have less than $200 billion in cuts in their budget. Now, how you go from $2 trillion to $200 million is a very, very strange combination. And I'd say, how do you, I get that you can pass a bill. How do you actually reconcile it with the Senate?
Judy, you want to weigh in on this as well? Give me a little fodder here, a little grist for that interview. Sort of what are you most interested in as you kind of watch all of this unfold? And I should say that does seem to be the tack of Democrats here as these negotiations take place. They don't have a whole lot of power. They're not, shall we say, actively involved in these conversations or these negotiations.
That's right. Not a lot you can do when you are out of office. So you just get your popcorn, you sit back and you watch the fireworks. I think for Chairman Arrington, I think one of the big questions that I have is what are his red lines? As it pertains to cutting the deficit, it's something that he has talked so vocally and so long about. Where is he going to be in terms of what is not enough? As obviously chairman, he's also got to deal with these caucuses I was just mentioning. How do you deal with those? And of course, the big question here, I think, from the Democratic perspective is if they do need to call on Democrats to raise the debt ceiling, which is something many Republicans haven't been willing to do, what are they willing to give away or negotiate on, if anything? So those are my big three, David. I can't wait to hear the interview. I know it's going to break a lot of news.
Thank you very much. Sheehan, Zaino, thank you very much for your time today. Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. My thanks to Rick Davis as well, partner at Stonecourt Capital. Both of them, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributors, giving us some perspective here, what's happening on the one end of Pennsylvania Avenue at the White House as we have the president meeting with the Prime Minister of Canada behind closed doors, and what's been happening up on Capitol Hill as well as Republicans are tackling reconciliation and trying to get that big, beautiful bill into a form that they can vote on and try to pass for the President of the United States. Much more to come here on Bloomberg's Balance of Power. We're going to talk with a former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Canada, about the relationship, the long-standing relationship between these two countries. That's coming up on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. The U.S. trade deficit hit a record $140.5 billion in March. That included the biggest ever rush on pharmaceuticals as companies hurried to get ahead of tariffs. We do check markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 now down 0.8%. NASDAQ down 0.9%. The Dow also down 0.9%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.31% and the 2-year yield at 3.79%. The economy's downturn is starting to affect ultra-budget carriers as people who cannot afford to fly stop flying altogether. That's left mostly business travelers and loyalty points users. Discount carriers like Spirit and Frontier are struggling due to higher costs, competition from legacy carriers, and a fatigue factor among the flying public, leading them to shift toward fuller service cabins. Now, the original ultra-low-cost model is seen now as unsustainable. Spirit and Frontier evolving toward more consumer-friendly approaches, and legacy carriers are offering their own no-frills options. Friedrich Merz has succeeded in his bid to become the next German chancellor during his second vote in parliament. That's just hours after he suffered a historic defeat in the first round. The conservative leader had been expected to smoothly win the vote to become Germany's 10th chancellor since World War II. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back now to Balance of Power with David Gura.
Amy, thank you very much. David Gura in for Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons on this Tuesday as the President of the United States meets with the Prime Minister of Canada at the White House. A lot of uncertainty surrounding this meeting, but it got off on a good foot, I think you could say, in the Oval Office as those two leaders sat in front of the fireplace and fielded questions from reporters. And the President lavishing the Prime Minister with a lot of praise, calling him a good person, a talented person. Said he thought he was excellent during the course of the campaign and talking an awful lot about the longstanding friendship between the U.S. And Canada. That's where I want to go now with the former ambassador, Bruce Heyman, former U.S. ambassador to Canada, spent about 4 years in Ottawa on behalf of the United States. Before that, he was a partner at Goldman Sachs, which is where I should say Mark Carney spent a good chunk of his career as well. He joins us from the global conference that the Milken Institute is convening out in Beverly Hills, California. I know you were busy with all of the goings-on there out in California. Probably didn't get to watch those comments, but I look at what you posted on X yesterday. You wrote, "Big day tomorrow for Canada-USA relations." Ambassador Heyman, help us understand the importance of this moment and what you hope will come out of this meeting taking place between President Trump and Prime Minister Carney.
So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. There is no more important relationship that the United States has than with Canada. It is our best trading partner. Yes, it is, regardless of what you hear. It's our ally. It's our neighbor to the north. And Canada has always been there for us in our time of need, in our darkest hours, 9/11, Iran hostage crisis, storms. We just saw it recently in California where they sent the water carriers in to pour water over the fires in Southern California. Look, Canada's always been there for us, and I think what's happened over this last 110 days has been jarring, unsettling, and upsetting to Canadians, and rightfully so. I think today's meeting is a beginning of a reset moment. I would say beginning, but I would say everybody was watching. The body language, the handshake at the beginning, the Oval Office, where I've been in that Oval Office with Prime Minister Trudeau and President Obama. I know the context of it, and I know the feel of the room. It actually felt pretty good watching the clips here this morning. Now, we will have more details as the day goes on, but I think this is a beginning of a reset moment, and I think it's an important one for our bilateral relationship.
And I'm going to pick up on your metaphor of using natural disasters here. Over the course of the presidential campaign here in the U.S., you were fond of issuing a tsunami warning, indicating that if President Trump were to win, this could be, as I think you put it in an interview with Politico Pro, super bad, potentially super bad. When you think back on what you were warning about then, and indeed what has come to pass since then, was the super bad assessment merited? Is this as bad as you thought it might be in terms of how the relationship between these two countries has worsened in recent days?
Actually, it was a bit worse than I had expected. I did not anticipate a proposed cross-the-board 25% tariff, nor the language of the 51st state, which I think was wholly inappropriate. All of that was completely jarring for the Canadians, and being as upset as they are, look, you guys know this. The flights booked over the next several months from Canada on a pleasure basis or social basis to the U.S. are down 75%. The purchasing of American goods is not happening, whether it's in liquor stores, grocery stores, or otherwise. I mean, people are upset in Canada, and I think we need to find a pathway to fix this, and I think this is a good day to start.
I should say I just flew back from Montreal, and the airport, the terminal in which flights from Canada to the U.S. originate, much emptier than I've seen in the past. And to your point about liquor store shelves, I went out to dinner. There was a kind of a fire sale on Californian wine. They were trying to get rid of it, which was to my benefit while I was there. Let me ask you sort of what you hope to come out of this conversation. So I think that the broad line that we got from the President and the Prime Minister is, look, there's a friendship between these two countries. Talks are going to go well. They're not going to talk about sovereignty over the course of their meeting at the White House today. What to you would constitute a success? So we've seen the kind of good, very evident visuals that these two men are seemingly getting along well. What tangibly would you like to see or hear about when these meetings conclude?
So I do not anticipate an agreement being waved in the air. That should not be anticipated. And I do not anticipate that all things will be healed. We heard that even in the early conversations with regard to President still wanting tariffs and the back and forth that's going on. But we need a framework in which the two countries can sit down with respective sides behind closed doors and sit down and discuss a path forward and work on a constructive give and take. And let's get this bilateral trading agreement fixed and updated and in an expeditious way. You know, USMCA, which was the president's agreement, is up for review next year. And so why wait till all the way through to next year to review that? In my opinion, that review should begin post-haste. And we should sit down and figure this out so that we can get an agreement that everybody's comfortable with. So business leaders here at the Milken Institute and throughout the United States can get comfortable investing in Canada, which they should be. I think it's an amazing investment opportunity to be investing in Canada today. And I am encouraging people. I also think it's an incredible opportunity to go visit Canada. And, you know, what a beautiful country. And if you want to have an international travel experience and take your family or friends, go to Canada. I think you'll really have a wonderful time.
Bruce Heyman, I want to ask you lastly for your perspective or insight into who Mark Carney is. As I mentioned, a colleague of yours at Goldman Sachs, somebody that I know you've observed when he was in his role as a kind of technocratic personality in Canada, running the Bank of Canada, and then, of course, running the Bank of England as well. He's a political novice, something he touted often when he was on the campaign trail. Just give us some insight here into how he approaches thorny issues like this one, this seemingly intractable one, sort of what you're going to be watching for, what we should be paying attention for in terms of how he kind of comports himself and approaches this job.
So everybody should know this is a serious person. He is smart. He is well educated from Harvard to Oxford. He has had incredible jobs leading the Bank of Canada during a financial crisis, leading the Bank of England during Brexit. He sat on some of the most significant boards from Bloomberg to Brookfield. He is a seriously smart and effective and experienced person. To sit at this moment is an important moment because that's what we're talking about: global trade, tariffs, economy. So he comes in with a great deal of competency. He also has a sense of humor, and he also, you know, has a love of music, and he is a balanced, wonderful person. I think this is a good leader for Canada at this moment, and I think the Canadians are going to be proud of what he does in these meetings with Donald Trump, which are not easy. We've seen many leaders come in and out of that Oval Office and have very different experiences, and I think this is at least setting up to be a very good one for the Canada-U.S. relationship.
Bruce Heyman, thank you very much. He was, for about 4 years, our man in Ottawa. He joined us from the Milken Institute's Global Conference in Beverly Hills, California. Very grateful for his time on this Tuesday as that meeting between the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Canada wraps up. Over on Capitol Hill, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was testifying today before a House panel on all manner of issues, and something he talked about over the course of that testimony was the so-called X date, when the U.S. is going to hit its borrowing limit. Let's hear what he had to say about that.
We will share with Congress when we believe we are approximating that date, so that will be forthcoming. But I will tell you, just as an outfielder running for a fly ball, we are on the warning track, and when you're on the warning track, it means the wall's not far away.
The wall is not far away. For some more insight into this, I want to bring in Dan Flatley. He covers the Treasury Department, and Secretary Bessent for us here at Bloomberg News. Dan, great to see you in person. There is a hunger on Capitol Hill, especially among Republicans, as negotiations over that big, beautiful bill continue, for what that X date is, what it's going to be. What is your sense, yes, from the testimony we heard today, but from your reporting of, A, when we're going to get insight into that, and sort of where on the calendar it might fall?
Yeah, David, it's a great question. And actually, it was a Republican who asked Secretary Bessent this question in the hearing today. And he sort of disappointed us all by saying, you know, we don't have that yet, or we're not prepared to share that. Although he had a very interesting comparison to an outfielder running for the fly ball, as we heard there. I think that he has said in the past, and Treasury has said sometime in the first half of May. So obviously we're in that window right now. Why this matters is because Congress, as you well know, David, needs a deadline in order to get anything done. And the X date really is like the deadline of deadlines, because Bessent, later on in his testimony, made a point of saying the U.S. will not default on its debt, will not breach the debt ceiling, ultimately will pay its obligations, and that is what you'd expect him to say, but still a very important thing for him to say. And so when you're talking about the tax bill that the Republicans are working on, when you're talking about revenue from tariffs that they're looking at, when you're talking about all of the things that are happening with the economy, it really kind of comes down to that, what we call the X date. So we didn't get it today. We may get it any day now, really. And so we're all sort of on tenterhooks waiting. And so, he's keeping us in suspense.
We had Nathan Dean on a little earlier, and he referred to Scott Bessent as the calmer in chief. That's the role that he's playing in this administration. We certainly saw that on display in California yesterday when he talked to global investors. Was it the same Scott Bessent in that hearing room today? Sort of, what's the role as you see it that he's playing as he kind of communicates this president's, yes, economic vision, but also sort of gives a status update on the president's economic agenda?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it was during his confirmation hearing, one of the senators remarked to him that he must have a pulse rate of about 40 beats per minute. So he does kind of project this very calm, cool, collected affect. At times, I think that caught some members off guard. They wanted him to be maybe a little bit more animated. When you heard some of the questioning from Democrats, they wanted him to answer some of their questions and wanted him to do it quickly. And so, he uses kind of that that demeanor to his advantage in those types of scenarios. But certainly he has kind of played this role of calming the markets. We did see stocks pare some of their losses after he spoke on trade. He mentioned that he thinks that 80 to 90% of the trade deals that they're sort of actively working on could be negotiated by the end of the year. We're hearing different timelines, obviously, on these trade deals, and we haven't yet seen one materialize. And then, of course, President Trump came out later and said that, he's going to negotiate these deals on his own terms, and he's not looking at lowering tariff rates necessarily. So maybe some good cop, bad cop, maybe some of a calming force, somewhat of a more energetic, some might say chaotic force. That certainly seems to be part of the strategic uncertainty, to use a phrase that Secretary Bessent used today, to try to bring some of these deals over the finish line. But I think that he played his role relatively well today in terms of answering questions before the House Appropriations Committee. Tomorrow he'll go before the House Financial Services Committee, much bigger panel, a little bit more raucous in terms of the questions that he's expected to get. And so we may see him pressed on some of these issues a little bit more than he was today.
Very quickly, just about 30 seconds. We've talked about his role with investors on Capitol Hill. How about in these trade talks themselves? What's his remit, or what is he focusing on?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, he kind of inserted himself really into the middle of a lot of these trade talks, including with Japan, which he has a history with as an investor. He's now kind of taking a little bit of a step back. He was asked the other day, saying the U.S. trade representative is handling a little bit more of the details and stuff like that. But the officials from Japan were at Treasury last week, so he's still very much involved, for sure.
Very much involved, for sure. We'll look forward to your coverage of the hearing tomorrow. Dan Flatley, thank you very much. Dan Flatley covers the Treasury Department for us here at Bloomberg News, and we did hear from the Treasury Secretary about the status of those talks between the U.S. and China. He indicated that those negotiations are not underway, and that was certainly a question that was asked of the president during that prelude to the meeting that he's having with Prime Minister Mark Carney, and the president of the United States saying no negotiations have taken place, but they do want to meet. China does want to meet with the U.S. Continuing to follow those meetings at the White House, Prime Minister Mark Carney is scheduled to hold a press conference of his own a little later this afternoon. Bring you coverage of that as the afternoon unfolds here on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. David Gura in for Kaylee Lyons and Joe Matthew here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.